Peace and love, everybody. It's your host, Nikita X, and this is the third episode of the show, Black Movement Radio. And the title today, we will be discussing how Asian slaves became Indians. I'm going to go into depth about how Chinos became reclassified as Indians or indigenous people. Moreover, while indigenous people were reclassified as African and Negroes, Chino slaves were allowed to obtain an indigenous identity and status. The main source of information used for this discussion will be from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico, From Chinos to Indians by Tatiana Sayas. What's interesting here is that the subject of Asian slaves in Spanish America is not discussed or widely known. In fact, in Tatiana Sayas' book, she states that her book is the first that traces Chino origins in Asia. My goal in this particular episode is to touch on key points which is not readily known to the public. All right. After parts of Asia were conquered by the Spanish crown, Asian people were put into slavery on their own land and later on shipped to places such as Mexico, Peru, and Chile. In other words, they were shipped to Spanish-controlled colonies in America. Now, this is a quote from the book, Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico. Quote, "The foundation of the Spanish Philippines gave rise to the trans-Pacific slave trade. Manila became the colonial outpost in Asia where slaves were purchased, and the Manila galleon ships afforded transport to Mexico. Manila was a slave society during the 17th century. Slaves did the majority of the labor, and master-slave relations shaped the general social order. Within years after the Spanish conquest, the bustling port city had some 40,000 residents of diverse origins. A full quarter of this population was enslaved. They were craftspeople, manual laborers, and servants who upheld their master's social structure. By the 1620s, the city had 8,000 indigenous slaves and 2,000 foreign slaves, in addition to an untold number of Muslim slaves. The whole of the city was a slave market, supplying labor to Spanish colonists and indigenous elites. Slave auctions were held in the plazas found within the city walls, and masters also sold slaves through individual transactions. The unorganized nature of the market makes it nearly impossible to quantify the volume of slaves, but it is clear that Manila was an emporium for slaves. Masters from throughout the Philippines knew to come to the capital to secure chattel property. Now, these slaves were from diverse places, and they were called Chino slaves. And they came from places such as Filipinos, India, Philippines, India, Bengal, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Japan, China, and other places. Now, once in Mexico, all of these people became Chino slaves. Now, here is a backstory of what took place in the Philippines. And what took place in the Philippines also mirrors what took place in America when both empires, the Philippines and America, fell to the Spanish crown. I'm going to read a page from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico, and it's from page 46.
I am Morpheus.
Okay. It says, quote, "The Spanish government instituted the same forms of labor organization in the Philippines as in the American colonies, first allowing colonists to have encomiendas and then pushing for reform with the reptimento system. Under encomiendas, a Spaniard was allotted a group of Indians who owed him personal service. Repartimiento was a crown control system that required Indians to work for nominal pay. Okay, so I use that quote just to show how what happened in the Philippines and the Americas, they operated under the same types of system, which was pretty much a caste system where the lighter skin would kind of become the Chino slaves or the Indians, and then at the bottom you would have the reclassified indigenous people being reclassified as Negroes working at the bottom in the sugar plantations and in the fields and the rice plantations. Okay, so that's why I use that quote to show that both the Philippines and Spanish America, now Spanish America, were under the Spanish crown. And the type of system that operated was the same in the Philippines, and it was the same in Spanish America, right? Now, at this point in history, the indigenous people were being subdued, and people belonging to the lighter skinned races helped the colonists subdue the real indigenous people of the land. A clear example of this taking place is in the Philippines. Quote, in the Philippines, both systems allowed for slavery because the native elites were responsible for delivering the laborers to the Spaniards. The lawful enslavement of the indigenous group Negritos exemplifies the leeway given to native chiefs regarding slavery. The colonial government gave permission to the indigenous elites of the larger ethnic group to carry out their own slaving raids. The Pangans, for example, who lived in a fertile province of Pampanga, had license to enslave Negritos. The Kapamapagans, you understand what I'm saying, excuse me for the mispronunciation. The Kapamangans were allowed to go to war against their natural enemies, enslave them, and make them work in the rice cultivation. End quote. So later on, Negritos were reclassified as Negroes and lost their indigenous status and became Negro slaves. Now, there are other words that they say that the Negritos, they say there really are Aeta, like Aeta, okay? Because Negrito means little Negroes. And I'm not sure what they were called at that particular time when their nation was being subdued by the lighter skinned natives. But they were indeed reclassified as Negritos, and they were forced to work on the rice plantation. And as you can see, what happened with the Kapamapagans, they worked with the Spanish crown to subdue the true indigenous peoples of the Philippines. Okay?
Afro-American origins, Black Native Americans. The greatest myth about the Black Native Americans is that they never existed. This myth has been perpetuated by numerous American films which record the Indian wars with the Apache and Lakota tribes. Whites have created a myth that there were no Black Native Americans. They teach that the only Black Indians were slaves of the Mongoloid Indians. This is false. There were many Black Native American nations when Europeans arrived in America. In fact, Blacks have been in America for 100,000 years. Archaeologists have reconstructed the faces of ancient Americans from Brazil and Mexico. These faces are based on the skeletal remains dating back to 12,000 BC. Researchers working on these ancient people note that they resemble Negroes or Africans instead of contemporary Native Americans. These ancient people are called Paleo-Americans. In the Smithsonian magazine, Dr. Chatters, who found Naia's skeleton, noted that the small number of early American specimens discovered so far have smaller and shorter faces and longer and narrower skulls than later Native Americans, more closely resembling the modern people of Africa, Australia, and the South Pacific. This has led to speculation that perhaps the first Americans and Native Americans came from different homelands, Chatters continues, or migrated from Asia at different stages in their evolution. Here is a picture of Naia. She is clearly Negroid. Black people were the first to build mounds in the Americas. These black Native Americans built mounds that resembled mounds that were built by black people in Africa. The mounds in the United States may have been built by Africans for defensive purposes, while they tried to coexist with local American Indian populations that lived nearby. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri mound sites are located on hilltops overlooking valleys and are clearly defensive works covering many acres with formidable walls of earth, sometimes reinforced by stone, all evidently chosen for their impregnability. In lowland areas where there were probably few inhabitants or unsettled land, the mounds are various geometrical enclosures, octagons, circles, squares, ellipses. These mounds were more likely built without military interventions. Here we can see two artifacts. One artifact is from the African mounds built by the Mandingo people, and another is an artifact that comes from an American mound. If you look at these mound artifacts, you can see that they resemble each other because they were built by black Native Americans. The defensive-style mounds found in the United States had lines of embankments, which averaged between 5 to 30 feet high, with enclosures hundreds of acres wide. Leading out from many of these enclosures, there often were parallel walls, many miles long, forming great avenues. Leo Weiner felt that these mounds resembled the African cities of Luanda in the Congo and the ancient city of Benin. W. Du Bois noted, the mounds of the mound builders were probably replicas of Negro forts in Africa. That this tendency to build forts and stockades proceeded from the Antilles, whence the Arawaks had come in the beginning of the 16th century, is proved by the presence of similar works in Cuba. These are found in the most abandoned and least explored parts of the island, and there can be little doubt that they were locations of fugitive Negro and Indian stockades, precisely such as those that were in use in Africa. Here we can see other mound artifacts. These artifacts clearly show Negro or African people. We also see a mound that was excavated back in the day. We see the various levels, and we see how the artifacts, bows, and other things were placed in these ancient black Native American mounds. The art from the American mound builders in Brazil indicate the presence of Malian military personnel. Richard Hull in Munyaye, African Civilization Before the Baturi, noted that, and I quote, the Mali Marines wore white caps on their heads and a white tunic. On the side of the skull caps worn by the Mali Marines. E. Murphy, History of African Civilization, said the uniform of the Malian military consisted of sandals, loose-fitting cotton breeches reaching down to the knees, a sleeveless tunic, and a white headdress of either cotton or leather, decorated with one or more feathers. Here you see two different ancient peoples. You can see that they wear the breeches that were identified as a normal military gear for a Malian Marine. The only occupied mounds seen by Europeans were those built by the African slaves, the Arawak Indians, and people in Florida. Hernando de Soto, the only European to see occupied mounds, tells us much about their construction and use. Here you can see some Caribbeans. These are the Carib people, the people who the Europeans met when they first arrived in the New World. Here's another picture of some of the Caribbean people, the Carib. Here we have a Carib woman who is with an West African. De Soto and his men discussed the mounds they found among the Florida Indians. Here, as mentioned earlier, lived some African black people. De Soto noted that at Ucinta, Florida, the town was of 7 or 8 houses built of timber and covered with palm leaves. The chief's house stood near the beach, upon a very high mound made by a hand for defense. At the other end of the town was a temple. It is interesting to note that in Florida, one of the major ethnic groups living there was the Yamasee or Jamasi people, which were described as blacks. The mounds in the United States were usually found near rivers. In the Ohio Valley, 10,000 mounds have been discovered. The north of the mound zone begins in western New York and extended along the southern shore of Lake Erie into what is now Michigan, Wisconsin, and northern states of Iowa and Nebraska. In the southern United States, the mounds lined the Gulf of Mexico from Florida to eastern Texas and extended up through the Carolinas and across to the state of Oklahoma. The Spanish called the Native Americans Indians because they were black like the South Indians. Here's a picture of the Caribs, the first people that Columbus and other Europeans met when they sailed in the Caribbean islands. As you will note, these people were black like African Negroes or sub-Saharan Africans. They have also found many black skeletons of these Indians in the Caribbean. Here we can see an article from Man, a monthly record of anthropological science. This article, published in 1939, made it clear that many Negroid or Negro slaves, Negroes, had inhabited the Virgin Islands in pre-Columbian times. That means that these black people were not slaves. These skeletal remains date to pre-Columbian times. So this shows that these black people were in the area, in the Caribbean, before the Europeans arrived. There were many black Native Americans. In North Carolina, there were many black Native Americans, including the Yuchi, the Creek, and the Yamasee. Carolina Indians were painted by many painters, including Philip George Frederick Van Reyck. Van Reyck, he did many beautiful paintings of these black Native Americans. Some of these black Native Americans belonged to other tribes between the Creek and the Yamasee. There were the Sokotan, the Yamacraw. These Indians, in a sense, fought many times the various European powers. But the black Native Americans had many wars, first with the Spanish and later the British colonists. These black Native Americans lived on the Atlantic seaboard from New York all the way down into Florida. These black Native Americans fought bravely for their lands. Some were sold into slavery into the Caribbean, while others were made slaves or identified as Negro freemen in the South. But the black Native Americans, they did not accept with passivity whites taking away their land. The black Native Americans had many wars, first the Spanish and later the British. Black Native Americans have a history of fighting Europeans for independence. This is especially true in the Carolinas. Here you can see a map. And on this map we can see many of the black Native American and also Mongoloid Native American tribes. Many of these tribes, Mongoloid and black Native Americans, live side by side. Black Native Americans fought the British. The most important war, or one of the famous wars of these black Native Americans, was the Yamasee War. Here we can see the Yamasee fighting the British. The Yamasee had their shields and their clubs, and some of them even had guns. And they were facing the one of the dominant powers of Europe during that period, and that was the British. Over here we can see other Indians who have been fighting some of the British. These black Native Americans were made into slaves after they lost the war. Sadly, some of these black Native Americans were even sold into slavery in the Caribbean. As you can see from the Caribs, that there were already black people on many of the islands of the Caribbean, and so when they sold these black Native Americans from the Carolinas into slavery in Barbados, Jamaica, and etc., they were joining other black people who had already existed there for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Many of these slaves worked on tobacco plantations. Most of the people that were forced to work on the plantations were women. The American planters felt that Indian women made good cultivators of tobacco, rice, and indigo. Here we can see some Indian slaves, a Mongoloid Indian and a black Native American being sold into slavery. They had created many laws to keep control over the black Native Americans and the Negroes. For example, here's a law from South Carolina written in 1722. Be it therefore enacted that all such Spanish, Negroes, Indians, Mustees, or mulattoes so imported into this province shall pay upon the public receiver for the use of this province a duty of 150 pounds current money of this province. So as you can see, there were many laws to contain and control the black people. Here's another law, and where the importation of Spanish, Indians, Mustees, Negroes, and mulattoes may be of dangerous consequence by enticing the slaves belonging to the inhabitants of the province to desert with them to the Spanish settlements near us. So as you can see, they didn't really like black Native Americans and African slaves to associate, because many African slaves would run away with the black Native American slaves, and they would join the Indians, and it was hard to get them, you see. So the Europeans tried to do everything they could to keep black people from Africa and black Native Americans from really joining or meeting one another. At first, the Europeans identified the black Native Americans as Indians, but over time, because the Carolina Indians were predominantly Negroes or blacks, both African and black Native American slaves were called Negroes, especially after the Yamasee War. Whites used bureaucratic erasure to take away the history and land of the black Native Americans. Black Native Americans who did not migrate to Indian territory or sold into slavery were forced to declare on government records and census that they were free colored. This was bureaucratic erasure because black Native Americans were listed as free colored people, just like black Europeans and freed slaves instead of Indians or Native Americans. This had severe consequences. Because the Indians were identified as free colored folk, that was like saying that they had never existed as an independent people. That was saying that the black Native Americans never had their own nations. Today, many black Native Americans, most Native Americans carry RM173. Here you can see a chart. As you can see, on this chart, that most Native Americans carry are M173. You can find out more about these ancient black Native Americans in David and Hotep's book, The First Americans Were Africans. Documented evidence. In this book, David M. Hotep provides considerable information about the black Native Americans. I also provide information on the black Native Americans in my book, African Empires in Ancient America. Other books that can provide you more information on these black Native Americans is The History of Blacks in America from Prehistory to 1877, written by myself, Dr. Clyde Winters, and especially We Are Not Just Africans, the Black Native Americans. In this book, I detail the history of blacks in the Americas. And I explained how black people went from dominating North America to becoming, in a sense, erased from history.